The Georgia Archives would like to welcome everyone as we celebrate the 150th anniversary of the Georgia Department of Agriculture. The Georgia Department of Agriculture is the oldest state department of agriculture in the United States. As we celebrate and commemorate agriculture in our state's history, we can also reflect on the broad impacts it has had on our state's culture and its citizens. We are excited about the wide variety of topics during this symposium and invite everyone to explore the agricultural records held here at the Georgia Archives through our finding aids on georgiaarchives.org and by visiting us here in Morrow, Georgia. We not only house the Georgia Department of Agricultural records, but also those from many other state agencies involved in agricultural and environmental pursuits. We would like to thank the Georgia Department of Agriculture for their cooperation in this symposium, as well as the Friends of the Georgia Archives and History and our staff members. The Georgia Archives is a unit of the Board of Regents of the University System of Georgia. It identifies, collects, manages, preserves, provides access to, and publicizes records and information of Georgia and its people, and assists with state and local government agencies with their records management. Please enjoy the following session on African American experiences and farming.
It's been super exciting what we've been able to see so far here today, and so we're just going to continue on. This is going to be our third session, African American experiences in farming. I'm going to go ahead and introduce all three speakers now, and then what we'll do is I'll do a quick transition in between, and we'll save all the questions for the end if that's okay, just in the spirit of sort of conserving time here and making sure we get everybody gets a chance. And so I'm going to go ahead and start with the introductions. Dr. George B. Ellenberg, Professor of History and Provost Emeritus at the University of West Florida, conducts research and teaches courses in the history of the Old and New South and agrarianism in American history. Followed by Michael Witherspoon. Michael Witherspoon is a passionate advocate for uncovering the agrarian and slavery history of Georgia's past. As the proud grandson of King Dennis Hadley, who was born on the Pebble Hill plantation, Michael's deep personal connection drives his mission to share often overlooked narratives, much like those of his ancestors. And finally, Dr. Mark Schultz. Dr. Mark Schultz is an accomplished historian with a PhD from the University of Chicago in history, complemented by an MA from the University of Georgia and a BA from Franciscan University of Steubenville. So without further ado, Dr. Ellenberg.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I would, first of all, like to thank the Georgia Archives. What a wonderful facility. I did research in the 80s at the downtown version, and this is just a wonderful place, and to Hendry and staff for hosting us here today. Before the break, we were talking high-tech, hydroponics, virtual tours, and I think this session we're going to roll back to a period, certainly with my presentation, as you can see, 1874, 1875, before the New Deal and before the USDA and before a lot of programs were in place to try to mediate, to support farmers, both black and white in the South, but particularly African-American farmers. And so this is a personal as well as a historical project for me. My dissertation and book were on mules, so people don't remember my name, but they remember that I'm the mule guy, right? And I focused on the place of the mule in Southern agriculture and Southern culture, and on mechanization. But this is a different sort of project. James Hewling's day book has been on my shelf for about 20 years or so, sitting there looking down from the shelf. Hewling is a distant relative, and so this came to me because I was interested in history as a young fellow, and I want to talk a little bit about Hewling's world, but also I think part of the session that we're beginning now is how to give a voice to those who don't have voices. How do you give voices to slaves? How do you give voices to sharecroppers and tenants? When Hewling writes the records, how do you give a voice to those other people? And so that's what I think, I hope that I can introduce us to a little bit today. Eric Foner wrote a book, one of the syntheses on Reconstruction. So I thought it appropriate, since we're talking about that time period, to look at, to have Huling and Foner side by side. Well, James Huling is buried at Independence Methodist Church in Tignall, Georgia, which is where my mother grew up. A tiny little town, you can see, in Wilkes County, and Huling lived in militia district. We're talking about militia districts later, 167 in Wilkes County. So we know that about James Huling. And Reconstruction was clearly a tumultuous time in the South. By 1871, however, two things were clear. Number one, the Democratic Party had reestablished total control in Georgia. And secondly, that perhaps dream of land redistribution was clearly not going to happen. And so blacks and whites had to work out a new modus vivendi. And emancipation in some ways changed everything, but in some ways it changed almost nothing. And so access to land was crucial for all farmers, but that landowning elite maintained political control, economic control, and social control, as we know. But James Huling's daybook reveals a sliver, and it's almost an agonizing sliver of life in Wilkes County in 1874 and 1875. Those were hard years for the South, for Wilkes County, for Huling, and for tenants, as they tried to figure out what is life to be like now. So Huling had been a significant slaveholder before the Civil War. 1870, you can see his household. He has several relatives living in his household, $12,000 in real estate, $1,000 in personal estate. And here we see again, to me, it's not so much Huling's household, but it is those who are not in his household with whom he has dealings, the tenants on his properties. So the daybook is about 108 pages, depending on how you count his daybook. And most of it is in pencil. Some of it is in dip pen. It is cursive, and it's interesting. Some of my students today do not read cursive, believe it or not. And so for the historical profession, for those of us that study pre-typewritten records, that's a real challenge, but that's another story. But it is an interesting development. So this is Huling's, this is the inside cover. And although you can't probably read it, Huling makes notes about his family throughout, where James Moss, which is how this book came into my possession, the Moss family. In Athens, he was going to school, and so he bought a trunk, he bought several items of clothing, handkerchiefs, a comb, a brush. So inside this accounts book, is my point, inside the accounts that Huling keeps are these slivers of family life, and even comments about tenants and sharecroppers on his land. So it's again sort of an agonizing sliver where you wish, wow, I wish we had all of his day books throughout his life, but we do have this one. So family life, but to me, the more interesting part of this is the tenant and sharecropper aspect of Huling's day book. This is intriguing, and it's probably, for me, the more illuminating aspect of the historical record, the bits of life that we can glean about the tenants that lived on Huling's land. Here, for example, we see a list of tenants for 1874 on the left page, and on a later page, the one on the right, is the amount of cotton each produced during that year. And so what we can do with that, you know, how we can pull what life was like in that relationship between landowner and sharecropper or tenant is an important part of where I want to go with this. Because also the accounts for each of those tenants are in there. So the book is filled with a list of, for each tenant, 50 cents for a plug of tobacco, this much for bagging, this much for this or that they purchased. Supposedly at Healing Store, although I cannot find a record that he owned a store, he's one of those small merchants, landowner merchants that had so much control over their local communities. So this is part of the intriguing part. And Hewling, as I said, lists purchases made by the tenants for the year and how each settled up with him at the end of the year, which was a crucial part of that landowner sharecropper relationship. And here we see these 2 years, tenants in 1874 and tenants in 1875. Again, just a very quick snapshot of Hewling's tenants on his property. In the previous slide, we saw that Watt Jones, for example, rented land and produced 6 bales of cotton. Here, this is a frustratingly brief glimpse of tenant persistence from 1874 to 1875. 1874, some tenants rented and some were farming on halves. They were half of that crop. Half of the proceeds from the crop after all was settled up would go to the tenant. And it appears, and some of them are renters, but it appears that even the renters, that Hewling is providing the note for that rent. So they're not paying cash to Hewling. They're essentially taking out a loan to be renters rather than sharecroppers. And sometimes the difference between renting and sharecropping was owning a mule, for example. It was the means of production that were so crucial for those. And then there are embedded stories in this. Gabe Hewling, one of the tenants on that list, James Hewling notes, he went to Atlanta, and James Hewling says he's a rascal and I hope never to see him again. And there is a lot of frustration, I think, built into James Hewling's approach to this. And so again, what I hope to be able to flesh out a little bit is, well, there's another side of this story. And it would be wonderful to know why Gabe Hewling decided to go to Atlanta, certainly for opportunity, but certainly there's something going on between Hewling and Gabe Hewling. So he's a rascal. I never want to see him again. And then on the next page, there are more thoughts about Hewling. And you can see how disorganized this daybook is. As he settles up accounts, he X's them out, but they go from one page, maybe 10 pages later, where he has something else as he works through the year here. But here we have more thoughts about Gabe Hewling, pages 48 and 85. Hewling once again writes about, James Hewling writes about Gabe Hewling. After calculating and paying Gabe Hewling $5.85, James Hewling notes settlement made with Gabe the 3rd day of December, 1874, and that Gabe was paid in full. But then he has another note, a kinder personal note. Gabe Hewling, James Hewling writes, left my plantation the 11th of December, 1874 to live in Atlanta. I hope he may have good luck, do well, and make money, and take care of it and not spend it for whiskey. He was my house servant, and I treated him well as long as he stayed with me. Sorry when he left. So there is part of that, what I characterize as a tortured relationship. You know, slavery and race perverted the human relationships in the South. And it was what I see as a tortured dance between African Americans and whites as they work through this. So there's more there with Gabe Hewling and James Hewling. And then there's also the potential here to follow at least some of the tenants given the information in Hewling's daybook. Watt Jones, for example, is listed as a farm laborer on the 1870 census, but as a farmer on the 1880 census. Now, this may just be semantics, and it may just be the way that the census taker wrote this down, but it is possible to be able to track him and see if indeed he did own land in 1880 when he didn't in 1870. And then we'll wind down here with a couple. We'll return now to James Hewling here. He died in 1879, but the last years of his life must have been very difficult. Here he talks about his skin disease, and there are recipes for itching and skin diseases throughout this book. He's searching for some relief. He's always, in his later years, being plagued by some kind of skin disease, itching, and it apparently drove him to distraction. There are multiple recipes, as I said, and washes for his skin. And here we read that Dr. Stanford stayed with Hewling the night of June 17th, 1874, and gave him, quote, a wash for the itching and bitters to be taken 3 times a day. But then Hewling notes, matter-of-factly, that on June 30th, Dr. Stanford, who had stayed with him that night, was taken to Washington and put in jail for committing a crime on Miss Murphy, a girl of 14 years old, charged with rape. And so we have these little snapshots of life in Wilkes County in Militia District 167. And certainly we can track that story down in the newspapers. And then matter-of-factly, after that, he goes back to, okay, here's another doctor that saw me for itching and my skin problems. This book is also filled with prayers and a lot of hymns that he has copied down. And so we're going to end with Hewling apparently received little relief from skin disease and sought relief in prayer as well as song. And the hymn on the right is one of Isaac Watts, When I Can Read My Title Clear. I won't sing it today, but it is I mean, you can find it on the web and hear what it is. It's an American folk tune that it's put to. And then on March 27th, 1875, on the left, Hewling says, I have made up my mind not to suffer much longer, all the time suffering with a burning, itching, suffering all the while and scratching, no pleasure to myself and nobody else. Doctor can't give me any relief. I'm tired of suffering in this world. And then on July 7th, he bought of Dr. W.P. Anderson 10 powders to stop bowel complaints for $1.25. On July 20th, 1875, he wrote, Good Lord, at the top of the page, you can see that. Good Lord, have mercy on Sister, George, and myself, and save us in heaven. I beg for Christ's sake. All indications are that his final years were not pleasant, but details of that are lost, although perhaps he continued to chronicle his life in other day books, which we no longer have. So what I would like to do, there are a couple of paths for this project. One would just be a transcribed day book, which I think would be a wonderful source for other historians who can take a look at it from a different perspective. There's also the potential for doing a business type approach to this, where the accounts for each tenant are analyzed. And then, of course, the bigger project, which I kind of tried to allude to today, would be that James Hewling's world, and not just James Hewling, but those tenants and sharecroppers on his land and how they lived as well. Thank you.
Dr. Ellenberg, I'd like to present you with one of our marble pieces here, again, from the old Georgia Archives building.
Thank you very much.
But you can go on YouTube and see Crumble if you're interested. It's
very good.
But thank you again.
Thank you.
If you have any questions, please write them down. Sorry. Oh, you're okay. All right, and our next presenter will be Mr. Michael Witherspoon, Sr. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank each and every one of you for being here, and thank you to Georgia Archives for putting on such a wonderful event commemorating 150 years of the Georgia Department of Agriculture. I have learned so much the time that I've been sitting here, and so hopefully you all will get some value from what I present today. Seeds of Change. Unearthing the hidden narratives of slavery in Georgia's agrarian history. Before I get started, I want each of you to take a moment and think, if you were a fruit tree, what kind of fruit do you bear? Because within this presentation, you will discover the fruits and seeds produced by those who were slaves during this period, along with their stories or narratives surrounding agriculture, because just as the crops were industrialized, so were the families, because my grandfather, he had 15 children. My great grandparents had 20 plus kids. And so after, slavery, they all at one time had hundreds of acres of land in the South Georgia area. So as we're commemorating the 150 years of Georgia Department of Agriculture, it's very important for me to stand before you today to speak on behalf of those who lived during that period. Now, the agrarian economy of South Georgia, it was heavily reliant on slave labor, which was brought to Georgia in the 1740s. And this was done illegally for the profitability of grapes, silk, mulberry trees, cotton, rice, indigo, corn, and there was tobacco plantations. The reliance on slave labor was integral to the economic prosperity of these plantations, shaping its social and cultural fabric. In 1734, General James Oglethorpe established the Trustee Garden in Savannah, Georgia, and this was done 2 years after the founding of the Georgia Trust. This garden was to be modeled after the botanical gardens in Oxford, in England. The garden in Savannah was also intended to be an agricultural experiment for semi-tropical products, mainly silk and wine, that Georgia was to provide for the English crown. Now, there was leaves that was important, white mulberry leaves, which were to feed the silkworms. And they also imported the vines, which were to, produce grapes. They also imported orange trees and cotton and olives. And so as we fast forward to the introduction of Eli Whitney's cotton gin, Georgia became known as the Empire State because it had a huge economic boom during the 1840s, because it was this period where we begin to see the transformation in the development of agriculture. And so most of these narratives that I speak on today, they all take place in the South Georgia, North Florida area known as Thomas County. And the plantation setting is Pebble Hill Plantation on 319. And it's a very beautiful place. If you've never been to Thomas County, if you've never been to visit one of the plantations, I do suggest you visit Thomasville, Georgia, visit Thomas County, go and see Pebble Hill Plantation. It is a very large place. It is very beautiful, and it is endowed with so many beautiful flowers and history. And our ancestors are buried there on the plantation, not just there, but there are a few plantations in the area that our families are buried on. There's also the James Jack Hadley Black History Museum that is owned and operated by my uncle, where he has also housed a lot of local Black history there in Thomasville as well. So again, slavery was big business during the 1800s in Thomas County. According to the book, History of the Black Community from 1827 to 1909, written by Harold Henry Spangle Jr., the cash value of slaves was the measure of economic prosperity. There were tax records for the county in 1857 that placed the value of slaves at $3.7 million as opposed to an estimated value of $2.1 million for the land. In 1858, cotton also sold for nearly 12 cents a pound, and the value of an African was about $100 for every penny of cotton sold. Now, according to Thomas County records, there was a blacksmith on a plantation named Price, whose value was roughly around about $1,200 in 1838. Now, that value was also equivalent to, now get this, 250 acres of land at $3 an acre, 20 cattle, 2 oxen, 100 head of sheep, 1 blind mule, a bottle of good whiskey, and if you're into ostrich feathers, you can also add 3,200 of those at 2 cents each. Now, during this same period, New York City ran out of gold and silver that resulted in the major recession called the Panic of 1837. Now, this financial crisis led to slaves losing over half their value, as well as cotton dropping from a high of 17 cents to as low as 4 cents a pound. And just to show how valuable slaves were in the South during this depressed market, skilled slaves remained more valuable than agricultural workers and house servants. So as you can imagine, this was a very challenging period up to the Civil War, but despite the hardships, slaves formed tight-knit communities and support systems that helped them endure these harsh conditions. Richard Hatley, my great-grandfather, was born a slave on a plantation where he was a water boy for the slaves. He was tasked with keeping the slaves hydrated on the farm, which, by the way, is the origins of the water boy that we know in sports. So whenever you watch football and see the young guys out there getting water for the players, you can now see what my great-grandfather's job was on the plantation. So you can imagine it's a very important task. And, it gets pretty hot here in Georgia. So within slavery, the water boy job wasn't just limited to the plantation field, but water was a necessity for other agricultural needs, such as for the animals, for the machines, and so forth. Because before the 1700s, the agricultural industry was predominantly run by slaves and animals. And so as the demand increased, water became one of the most important driving forces behind the Industrial Revolution, because we begin to see the shift from domestic production to the factories as a result of the steam engines. Not only as the water boy, but my great-grandfather, he worked in the field also, but he worked closer to the plantation big house, which is the owner's home, because his position on the plantation was a little bit more flexible as opposed to those who worked solely in the fields and in the house. And besides that, my great-grandfather, he was the son of the owner, so he had extra privileges. And so as he got older, he was tasked with blowing the bullhorn, to call the slaves in from the field. And, that bullhorn, it lived on my mother's mantelpiece as far as I can remember. I remember I used to play with it when I was a kid, and eventually my mother bought me a trumpet so that I could play it in the band. That bullhorn is now housed in the Jack Hatley Black History Museum in Thomasville that my mother donated for our family's history. So again, Richard, he saved his wages and put them in what he called a chipping box. And one interesting fact that we discovered during an interview with my grandfather, his son, and we don't have all the details, but for whatever reason, during his early years, his chipping box had to be buried. And that was with all the paper money, gold and silver. And so however many years it was, when it became safe, when he opened the box, he had discovered that all the paper money he saved had decayed, and all he had left was around $800 in gold and silver coins. But that was a lot of money, for a former slave, now freedman in South Georgia. But what we do know is that once he gained access to what was left of his money, he took what he had and bought 300 acres and used it to farm a variety of fruits and vegetables such as sugarcane, cotton. He had sweet potatoes, corn, chicken, and of course he had cows. But this is a unique story that was passed down, to his son, my grandfather, King Dennis Hatley, and was recorded on an audio tape back in the 1970s, because he was able to do all of this with no education, and his wife only had a second grade education. Now, speaking of his second wife, who is my great grandmother, Lula Reed Hatley, she was hired as a babysitter at the age of 9, taking care of the plantation owners' kids, where she learned to read because she, as a kid, as a babysitter, she would entertain them and they would read and teach her what they learned in school. Now, though they were just kids and playing games, it soon benefited her later because she learned to sing and play musical instruments, as she entertained the kids. So, it was told that, she could play several instruments like the accordion, the harmonica, she could play the organ, and she could play the piano. So some of the family even tell how she could play music with the hair comb, right? So, but although, it was a job, slaves were developing skills and talents that became, a necessity, like my great grandmother, because she became very popular among the plantation owners who sought after her, for her entertainment. Not only did she have musical and entertainment talents, she was also known for crocheting, knitting, she sewed, she canned fruits and vegetables, and curing meat. Farming within the Black community developed a bartering system that ultimately created community. It created a family structure. And unfortunately, our current generation won't experience that. And that's why we're here today, just to let them know that although it was rough during that time during slavery, they made it work. But again, all these gifts and talents were passed down to the next generation because all the kids, my aunts and uncles, they all sing, play piano, and some of them made quilts. And just to name a few, my Aunt Marie, she became a popular opera singer. My Uncle Richard, he was a band and music director, as well as my Aunt Louise. And all 14 of them, they all achieved a higher education and even taught school. So as I begin to wrap this up, here's a picture of my grandmother, Rosetta James Hatley, and my grandfather, King Dennis Hatley. And this is her pantry where she stored all her canned foods. It was said that she would can over 100 jars of blackberries they picked from around the house. And I can remember my mom doing the same with figs and pears on Sundays. I can still smell the aroma and see my mom in the backyard mad at the birds that ate her figs before she could pick them during the summer. And this is my aunt. She lived to be 100 years old. She lived to be 101 years old, and also carried these traditions because I can remember the muscadine bush in her backyard where she made juice. And I ride my bicycle to go and get the juice and bring it back to the house for us to drink during the week. She was an excellent cook, like her grandmother. She was a successful cook who worked for an established dentist and traveled as his personal cook. So farming, gardening, cooking, it's a part of the family in some kind of way. And, my mom, she loves her blueberry bush. My cousin Joe Walden, he has a large farm of 100 acres that he used to sell hay. My other cousin, she just started a peach orchard, not only because it's a family inheritance, but the food just tastes much better when you grow it yourself. Thank you.
Right, I'd like to present Mr. Witherspoon with, again, this piece of granite from the Georgia Archives building.
All right, thank
prior
you.
to this one.
All right.
Appreciate you sharing.
Thank you.
Okay, and our last presenter for this panel is going to be Dr. Schultz. Okay, so
I'll try to do 15. Hey, y'all. Afternoon. It's been a lot of thinking. I don't know about you, but it makes my brain sometimes start shutting down. So I'm going to try to yell y'all awake, use my teacher voice and all that. I've been working about 20 years on this book that's coming out next spring. I'm about 3 days overdue getting the manuscript to press right now. So I'm like not even supposed to be here. My co-writer's angry at me. She's not. She's sweet, but like I need to get back to work. But I thought this would be an opportunity to share some of the work that we've been working on for quite a while, History of Black Farm Owners, which is, I think, one of the most understudied group of people in the entire United States. It's absolutely crazy. They make up a quarter of all African Americans in 1910, 1920. And the number of books on them is like, when we first started this project, I used to say for real, you could read the whole literature in a week. You could back then. Fortunately, there's a little bit more work that's being done. We got an NEH grant and studied the entire southeastern United States, got about 500 interviews with Black farm owning families, spent an awful lot of time here in the Georgia State Archives doing tax digest work, and some of that showed up on y'all's tables. So let me dive. I'm going to do a quick overview of the history of Black farm ownership and then tie stuff into what people have been presenting and Georgia specifically. And I'm also going to pose 2 questions and just cross my fingers in case somebody might be able to push me in a good direction. When the freed people first came into freedom, it seemed to me, and reading the Eric Foner, the literature, land was the primary thing on their mind. The vote, of course, reuniting families, of course, the ability to hold office, there was all kinds of things. But the desire of the freed people was a place of their own where they could direct their lives, where they could see themselves achieving an American dream that they could define themselves. The story of 40 Acres and a Mule, I'm sure you guys have all heard before. It came really close twice, which is one of the most heartbreaking stories I know in American history. Twice through Congress, once through military action. Land was almost fully given over to them 3 times, and then overturned each time by President Andrew Johnson, which makes him, in my mind, the worst president in all of American history, because that meant that Black folk came into freedom not just with the burden of prejudice and racism upon them, but with the burden of poverty as well. Just imagine if Black folk had started off being lower middling class at freedom. What kind of story would we tell now, rolling it forward 150 years? So they're mostly on their own after the attempts to get land for them in 1865 were blocked. And what Adrian Petty is who I'm writing this with. She's at William and Mary. We found that at the first generation, they did a lot of collective work. People who had fought in the Union Army, they got their final payment, and a bunch of men would pool their payments together and buy a plantation. And then break it up among themselves. Churches would come together under charismatic pastors and pool their money. And each person would put in what they could, and then they'd buy a plantation, sometimes with assistance from the Freedmen's Bureau, and then divide it up on the basis of how much each family had put into it. So they're thinking about working together in a collective kind of way. Oftentimes, railroads would come through an area and want to sell off land in a hurry and sell it to churches that were organized this way. I ran into off in the western United States, like Arkansas, where they were logging off the country at this time, late 19th century. Logging companies often didn't want to pay their guys on the very end of a job, and so instead of paying them, they just give them the logged off land. And because the logging camps tended to be segregated, all Black or all white, it settled people down in these all Black, all white communities like a checkerboard. That's not the way Georgia looks like. Arkansas, Black farm owning community, white farm owning community, Black farm owning. Georgia is all interspaced. So a very different kind of story in terms of where Black folk were able to get land. We're arguing that they wanted land. First thing that they wanted was land. And they were right. If you were coming out of slavery, the best chance you had of climbing towards the middle class was becoming a farm owner. I went through the the census records looking at all the other kinds of occupations. I hope y'all can see that in the back that were available to African Americans. So this is 1900. Occupations employing more than 20,000 people. That's all of them. Landless farmers make up 2 million, right? Families. So that's overwhelmingly the largest number right there. That's not a great path forward. Unskilled laborers, about 500,000. Servants and waiters, about 500,000. Laundresses, 220,000. And about the same number, Black farm owners. That's the only one of these large groups of people that bring home a kind of wage or give a family an opportunity to buy a home and climb in a community in a sense of respectability, community leadership, right? Everybody thinks that it's in the North that Black folk first got their leap forward. At least that's a lot of the books that I read. But that doesn't open up until World War I. Black folk were not allowed to join labor unions across the North. Almost every union was closed to Black people, which is why they did not move north before the Great Migration that comes in World War I, where they first opened up these kinds of jobs for them. So really funny, I argued that Booker T. Washington, in saying that the land was the best way forward, that he was right all his life, and then he was wrong. He died in 1915, and that's when it changes. And at that point in time, you're better off selling your farm and investing in, a business in the North. I mean, that's, I come out of farmers, right? Farming is not what I really strongly recommend as your way to make a lot of money in America. But for the period up until then, this was the best way forward, right? So most folks don't know this. 1910, 1920, which is when Black farm ownership peaks in America, 25% of all Black farmers own their own land. This is a time that 90% of Black people were farmers. So this is overwhelmingly large group of people, right, that really have just flown under the radar as far as attention given to them by historians. The Upper South, it was much easier to get land. 44% of all Black farmers in the Upper South were able to get land. Lower South was much more resistant, largely due to racism. So only 19% there. Georgia, I hate to say, I'm Georgia. I am Georgia. Georgia's dead last in the entire country. Only 13% of Black farmers were able to get land in the state of Georgia. Worse than Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, which are right next above us on the next step up. One thing that is different, though, Deep South versus Upper South, that if you did get land, it tended to be a larger piece of land. A lot of the folks who are farming in Maryland, Virginia, Maryland, it's like 70% of all Black farmers get land up there. Maryland, Virginia is 67%. West Virginia, it's about 80%. So a lot of folks up there are getting land, right? But they're getting 10 acres. They're getting 20 acres. They're getting 5 acres. And sometimes a little farm where you can grow a little patch of corn, a little bit of cotton, a vegetable garden, have a milk cow. That's a better way to go through the Jim Crow period than being somebody's sharecropper, right? So I'm not saying that's a bad thing. That was good for them. But in Georgia, people, I think it was an average of is it 60 acres? You've got it in front of you. One of my graphs. So it was larger farms. And because the Black population in Georgia, as well as the rest of the Deep South, is so much larger than the rest of the country, that means that the total sum of land that they owned was much larger in the Deep South than in the Upper South. In the late 19th century, all Black leaders, all folks who were interested in tracking progress of African Americans were 100% aware of the progress that Black farmers were made. And every couple of years, you'd see these people giving papers at conferences. And W.B. Du Bois, who everybody thinks about as on the urban side, he began his career writing about Black farm owners. Okay, really did. And they keep saying the total amount of land that Black farm owners own is equal to, and they kept increasing the size of the state. It ends up being the size of South Carolina. In other words, the state of South Carolina, if you divide it up, spread it across the South, is how much land Black farm owners owned at the peak. That's a lot of land right there. Okay? So the Upper South had much more of an open market in land, meaning if you had the money, you could you could buy it straight up. Maryland, Virginia, it was how capitalism is supposed to work, right? You got money, somebody wants to sell something, you can buy it. The Deep South was not that way at all. You could have the money, somebody else could want to sell land, and if you were black, you literally could not buy that land. Arthur Rapers, sociologist from the 1920s, 30s, did really good work in Georgia, and he's got really great reports on this. Like, you had to have a white patron, a sponsor, who would vouch for you, even if you had the money in pocket. You had to have somebody that would speak for you in the white community in order to buy land in Georgia if you were black. Then you had to have the permission of all the white farm owners in the area around that land. In other words, it was a very restrictive market, which is why the percent of black farmers is so much lower. They found all kinds of ways to make money. Sharecropping obviously is one way forward. Of course, the problem with that is you got to trust your landlord to be honest with you. People truck farmed. They did lumbering, trades, teaching. Michael said inheriting from white family, from white kin is how people got the largest chunks of land. It always was a family achievement. It's never a one-person job. One man alone never bought a farm, never. You get groups of people working together, extended family would work together. Oftentimes people would buy land when their children were old enough to plow, the oldest boys were. That's when families would make their leap forward. And because women tended to be better educated among black Georgians, they were the ones who kept the books, almost every family we looked at. And so it's a cooperative kind of effort. This is the graph I pulled together from the agricultural census showing, and I think do you have this one? I forget. This is the story of the rise and fall of black farm ownership. So starting from almost nothing, climbing really quickly from 1880, 1890, 1900, 1910, 1920, and then it starts dropping down. It's not a sudden decline, though, after 1920, right? It resurges during the Great Depression. People don't get jobs in the cities. They come back to the farm. They reinvest in it. And then mid-50s, the bottom falls out. And it's partly mechanization, so it's just hard to compete if you're a small farm owner. Also, there's enormous prejudice by the USDA that starts coming to the fore at that point. You guys may know about the Pickford case, where black farm owners simply were not given loans anymore from that point on in order to plant their crops in time. I've given you that, so I'm going to skip on through it because I need to move. And I'm going to skip that too. How important is this? Sorry about that. You got the graph, so you got those. How important is this in Georgia? Georgia State Archives. This is the tax digest here. This is all the wealth in Georgia in 1920, right? Taxable wealth. This blue third is only land that black folks owned. That's it. That's like a third of it right there. This is all city property here. This is larger than that. So farmland was far more important, like in terms of the total wealth of black Georgians in 1920. This is all other wealth, and black farm owners had a huge chunk of that because that other chunk of wealth is machinery for farming, was livestock, which farm owners had more of. At its peak, black farm owners owned about half the wealth of black America. Okay? So we need to pay attention to these people. Where are they scattered? The darker the color, the higher the percentage of land in the county that African Americans owned. And so along here, this very heavily black district. But what I find weird is that there's areas where I don't understand why it doesn't fit perfectly with demographics. In other words, you can have two counties side by side. They got the same crop. They've got the same kind of soil. They've got the same percentage of African Americans. And yet one county would be much more open. And gentleman who was talking about me moving from Peach County, for the ham and egg show, remember that, to the resettlement community in the 1930s, right? Another community was more open to it. We need local social history, right? To try to understand the difference between one community and another, why some areas were more open to black progress agriculturally than other areas. That's the black population map of Georgia. And you've got it. So I'm going to move on past that. You've also got this. This took me forever. This is a militia district map of black farm ownership in Georgia. And again, it's not an even spread map. You'll find some area where there's an enormous amount of Black-owned land and right next door, none at all. Well, why? I'd like to know. I really would like to know. And I'm only getting little guesses at it from what I've been able to pull together so far. I'm going to move past that. Quality of life. There were less often to be lynched, Black farm owners were, than sharecroppers, with one caveat. If they were in a community where there were very few Black farm owners, they were the most likely person to be lynched in that county. Anything went wrong, white folk would go for that person and kill them, whether they had any connection with it or not. Where there were larger numbers of Black farm owners, they actually were the safest people in the South. So it depended entirely where you lived, right? So we need to understand more about the communities that these people are living in, which we don't right now. They're able to raise their own food, had great images of canning and nutrition. And, you know, we know that sharecroppers were shorter, we're malnourished people, right? Not farm owners, right? They've got cows, they've got chickens, they've got pigs, they've got a garden, they're able to take care of themselves. They have the power of decision-making, including the power to decide how far on their kids go to school. If you were a sharecropper, you didn't get to decide how far your kids went to school. Planter would tell you when to take them out. Usually it would be pretty early. So when I go to family reunions of Black farm owners, I end up running into people who are in business, professions. I ran into 3 scientists at NASA, and I didn't seek out scientists from NASA. I sought out Black farm owning families, right? And boom, boom, boom. These people have done pretty well in America. People who were on the farm sent their kids to a high school. Often they'd have to board them because high schools for Black folk weren't spread all over Georgia, right? And they'd send their grandkids to college. So this is a fascinating story to me about progress in America. They end up moving north and going into the professions often. And people think that the wealth came from the north. And some of it did, but where's that foundation layer? That was down here on the farm. And here's the one I really need help with. Hendry, I was working last summer. I'm only here because he asked me to come here because I was trying to understand more about Black voting in rural Georgia in the Jim Crow period, which you would think there wouldn't be none, right? My first book was on Hancock County, Georgia, and I just started it 40 years ago. So I was talking to folks that were born in the 19th century back then. And I met white politicians who campaigned quietly in the Black community, right? Where would they campaign? They'd talk backdoor to Black pastors who pastored Black landowning communities. And those communities would vote as a block. And these white politicians told me that the elections in Hancock County, Georgia would swing on the vote of the Black folk in the 1930s, 1940s, right? They're supposed to be disfranchised, aren't they? Right? Everybody thinks they are. Read any book, they're disfranchised. Well, most Black folk were disfranchised, but not Black farm owners. And so I was here this past summer trying to figure out if other parts of Georgia looked like Hancock County, and it's mixed because, of course, things aren't simple. Some counties shut down all Black voting straight up. Everybody is just put down. How am I knowing this? Looking at the poll tax and who's able to pay it and who's not. Other counties, when the state moved to full disfranchisement back around, it was 1900, right? 1898, 1900 is when they got constitutional disfranchisement. Poor Black folks, sharecroppers, tenant farmers mostly stopped paying the poll tax. If they were paying it at all, they were, they disappear. Black farm owners keep going. Now, that doesn't prove that they're voting. I'd love to find out some evidence in all other kinds of parts of Georgia, but they keep going until the poll tax is discontinued in 1946. So they create a bridge of memory connecting Reconstruction voting with Civil Rights Movement voting. I convinced you we need to learn more about Black farm owners. Can anybody help me understand about how to find out more about Black voting by these farm owners in rural parts of Georgia? Because I'd really like to know more. And if anybody's got grad students that want to get a project, please, they got the field to themselves. All right, I think I'm out of time. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Your prize. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Oh, always wanted to do.
Make sure you get your hands
Spend more than many hours in this archive.
Okay. We do have some time for questions. So if anybody has written any questions down or has any questions for our presenters, we would love to allow them to answer those.
You remember a lot of immigrants from Ireland, Poland, Czechoslovakia were also denied rights of voting and had to pay poll tax and couldn't afford it also. And a lot of Irish and white immigrants, remember, died on the streets of starvation because white communities would not take them in if they were Irish or they were this or that. The Irish went into jobs nobody wanted, like cops, coal mining, stuff like that, that no one else would take. So it was all over the whole scene. It wasn't one population.
My wife's Kathleen Mary McDonald. So I know something about that, and it's still a different story.
Different story, but
I'd rather be Irish.
it was still there. Family history, okay.
Now, and I didn't call him, okay. So I was wondering, in Mississippi, there's always a story of Joe Davis' family. Joe Davis was brother to, B. Davis. And it always puzzled me a little that he said to his slaves and then his former slaves, oh, come on, make yourself comfortable. His bookkeeper was black and so on. And I'm wondering, is this an example maybe instead, not just of Joe Davis's big heart, because how big could it be, but of maybe this collective thing happening?
There were planters that broke up plantations. It wasn't common. It happened after the American Revolution, happened after Civil War II, that had some sense of loyalty to the people whose livelihood,
Yeah.
who created their own livelihood. Stevens County has a large plantation there that was broken up by the owners after the Civil War. He interviewed some of the people who got land that way. They still remember, where it came from. So it did happen. It did happen. Again, there's one former slave who was interviewed in WPA. He said wasn't exactly common, but there were white folks who continued some sense of responsibility for their former slaves afterward. Yes.
And sometimes there were blood relations there.
Oh, good.
Wow.
Yeah.
100%. 100%. Yep.
Okay, good.
And there's a whole lot of that. A lot.
And just to echo on that, that's how we ended up with a lot of the property because it was willed. Some of the houses and some of the tools, things of that nature were willed over to, some of the kids. Now, he had roughly around about 20 kids from the cook, but there was only 3 that were in his will. Okay. Because some of them had been sold off because he had gotten in trouble for having so many kids on the plantation. And so, but those that did stay, he ended up willing, some of those things. So, yeah.
Sell some kids and help some other kids out.
Yeah. He actually borrowed around about $11,000. And so like you were saying, some, the plantations got broken up and a lot of people, there was no work, right? And so they ended up going back to the plantation and the work and the life on the plantation was much better there than being in the city. And so they were making more money there on the plantation. So that's how they were able to save up and do more things because the Northerners that came down and purchased those properties, they treated them as such because they began to industrialize and set up those hotels and making it more of a resort area because it no longer operated that way. It became a hunting, quail hunting plantation. And so a lot of, powerful people, presidents would come down and utilize those spaces for that. Yeah.
Hendrick?
I have a question for Dr. Witherspoon about you've published published your family reunion books, but there seems like there's a lot of collecting, building the narratives, all the family stories. So how are y'all keeping them when they end up getting published? And
Well, I must not take the credit for my mother's work.
okay.
Please. This is my uncle's work as well. And so again, it begins with coming to those family reunions and they would take the time to sit down with some of the elders in the family and get them to tell their stories. And so they were really good at that because, it's just something that they've been doing all their life. And so my aunt, my grandfather's sister took the initiative. She was an educator. She started one of the first Black schools in the county. And so it has always been her deal to keep record. And so she was the organizer. And so her niece took, after her, and they began to organize together. And so those two women were, the trailblazers as far as that goes. So now we have, I think it's about 40 books, because every year there's a new book that's created because there's always some new information. Even if it's not new information, we still, print another book just to make sure, right? And so we keep that, and it's a tradition, and that's just how we do it. Yeah. And so, but this book here, my mother wrote this, but there's so much more that's supposed to be going. She broke her arm in the middle of completing this a few weeks back. And so it's still a work in progress. But she was supposed to have been here today to, to be here, but yeah. I hope I answered your question. Yeah.
I have a question because I have two sons who are 17 and 20, and I can't get them engaged, quite frankly. And their grandparents, my parents, my dad is going to be 90, my mom's going to be 87. So my parents had me late, and I had my kids relatively late. But I'm like, do you realize? Because my youngest son, he was like, I don't want to walk in my high school graduation. I'm like, your grandfather's 90, like he really wants to see this. But like a disconnect, but family history, my parents desegregated the University of Missouri. So they're from St. Louis. And I'm like, you all understand like the history you have in your family. These are your grandparents. They're just older than most of your friends. How do you keep the younger generation engaged when they are watching TikTok? And this isn't on TikTok yet. I don't know if it would engage them. So how do you keep the younger generations engaged in that family history?
Well, I'm gonna say this. I don't think there is an answer to that question. That's a good question. Hope someone can answer that.
You record, you have your grandparents or your parents record it, and then you play it sometime, and they'll eventually decide, hey, I want to know about this. And maybe a few years down the road, but then you'll have it recorded and it won't be lost.
Okay.
Now, I'm gonna tell you how I got interested was reading and finding out that my great grandmother, who never learned how to read or write, she was very talented, and she learned how to read or understand what things were because she would play with the white kids in the house. They were, her playmates. And so when they come in from school, they would teach her in playing, right? And so this is how she learned to understand so much. And so she learned how to play the piano because they allow her to play around with the piano and things of that nature. And so music had become a part of the family through her. So all the grandkids, everybody plays the piano, everybody sings, right? And I mean, everybody as a result of her. You see what I'm saying? And so for me, when I understood, because I never could read music, but I was able to play music based off just listening. And my mother always kept telling me, you got that from your grandmother. But it never clicked to me until I actually read it. And so just like what he just said, there were some things I didn't understand about my grandfather until my mother let me listen to, and it took, I'm in my 40s, when she just now let me listen to a recording of my grandfather. I don't remember him, know anything about him, because they was afraid to play the tape because the tape might break. You see, but I got to the age where she entrusted me to have it. And so I played just a snippet of it because I didn't want it to break, because I wanted to hear his voice. And when I heard it, something clicked as well. So you go digital. Yeah.
Sometimes it just takes age and becoming a parent. And unfortunately, your parents are old enough that by the time they're really interested, their grandparents probably won't be around.
Well, this is like from the sublime to the ridiculous, but blind mule. Now, they don't literally mean blind mules, do they? Don't they mean mules that are trained to not, were these mules really blinded, or are there blinders on them?
Well, you'll know. But the blind mule can still work.
But why would you blind a mule?
They don't blind them. A lot of times in the coal mines, they take the mules down there when they're young to open and pull the loads. They never come up till they die. So they never reach the soil, but they would bring some up if they wanted to have babies by them. And they would be blind because all the fumes in there blinded their eyes. They get
They could be malnourished. Mules supposedly could exist on almost nothing. Which is one reason that Southerners use mules. So malnutrition or an accident, getting hit between the eyes with a 2x4 could not being facetious there. But mules were not treated well. It's not. In cemetery. Well,
Maybe a silly question, just thinking maybe it was a phrase for something else.
Yeah, got one for George, which is you've got just a wonderful volume there. I've never seen a store volume with that kind of commentary written into it. Wouldn't it be possible to use that kind of as a nexus to get a view of the whole community around? And it would be, tax digest work and census work for each of the names, but track that rascal.
Exactly where I want to go.
Who was he and what did he do?
Yeah.
World. And I think, Beth, you said there's a device that you can use now that can pull up names for all kinds
I'm
of
thinking about this because you were worried about your students not being able to read cursive handwriting. Take a look at, Family Search, which is the website that's run by the LDS Church that has all the digital images of their millions of microfilms. They have a new laboratory tool called full text search. And I can show you, I was going to show you later, I pulled it up on my computer. It reads cursive, and of course it's in the beginning stages. So you can put in a name and a region, and right now they only have deed records and some probate records. And it just scans through and pulls up the cursive writing. They're not going to have to be able to read cursive writing or anything.
No, I still think they should.
Yeah, I do too.
Question here?
Thank you.
Until I guess a couple of months ago, I've been hearing operation for black coat, but then I kept thinking, no, never. But listening to the importance of black ownership, and this, I guess, both of you, your family, even my family, but you're saying the number of funds, I kept thinking, okay, well, some people did sell their property. A lot of black folks, their land was actually taken or stolen from them. In my family, that happened with my grandparents. And I've done some legal research at his courthouse, house in Mississippi. And the story was that my great grandfather, he was senile at the time, and everybody knew it's a small town. And one of the, actually an attorney, and I kept thinking, I was so surprised when I saw this was not only white man, but an attorney. Actually, apparently approached him and gave him several $1,000s, and I guess he actually found the deed from my grandfather, and his siblings got together, got an attorney, and from the county, a few, I guess you could say a few counties over, they were able to get the land back. But listening to you made me think of, there really is something to reparations, because a lot of land, people who, their land was taken. It was not handed over. And what would that property be? And I was thinking, looking at the amount of money that had been paid for my great grandfather's land, $20,000. I kept thinking of that, if they had not been able to get that land back, and just what that meant, but just listening to you just is opening my eyes that, maybe in our lifetime it might not be possible, but if this land was taken perhaps unwillingly, there should be a reason, just as in other countries, but I think with Germany, other countries where people were deprived of everything they had. This was not done willingly, but they were apparently reimbursed legally. And I guess for the first time, just learning all this, I'm thinking, yeah, people do have a point. And I just have to say thank you. I'm here.